The body is classical information. The mind is quantum information. Spirit is meaning, the meaning of quantum information. Each of us has to find out who we are through direct experience of being ourselves. You don't get there by reading books or parroting lines. That's what artificial intelligence is built to do. But a living mind can test, doubt, and change, because it can feel significance, not just compute patterns. Everything is connected. Life begins with the one. It doesn't begin with a cell. Quantum physics hints at a mind behind the universe, and a simple way to picture it is a color wheel: red, green, and blue. Say red stands for the body, green for the mind, and blue for spirit. Where the colors overlap, a new region appears, an interface. Each field is the observer, the observed, and the agent. So there must be a meeting point between body and spirit. What could that be? The permanent memory of the one's experience. Space, time, and matter. The stage where meaning becomes form, and form leaves traces. Here's the turn. Once you decide to begin your own search, the world tends to reveal the next step, quietly, in the right moment, and it will surprise you. In his latest interview, Federico Faggin, the engineer behind the microprocessor, pushes his account of consciousness and reality further. He begins with a rule. Put consciousness at the start of the story. Leave it for the end, and cosmology quietly assumes a universe with no experience built in. With that starting point, the universe is not a stage that accidentally produces observers. It is a whole that includes experience from the ground up. Faggin briefly mentions Scientism, which he treats as materialist and reductionist. In his view, it starts with separate pieces and hopes the whole will appear by addition. Quantum physics points the other way, a shared fabric where relations cannot always be pulled apart cleanly. That is why he reaches for entanglement. Certain systems show correlations that persist across distance, and an experiment in 2014 strengthened the case for non-locality. From there, he draws a simple conclusion. The useful starting point is the whole, because the universe is interconnected and nothing is truly separable. He offers a plain image. Between red and orange, there is no sharp border. There is a middle region that supports more than one description, depending on where you draw the line. For him, that continuity hints at why Qualia, lived experience, resists rigid categories when we talk about reality itself. He calls the whole the one, dynamic, holistic, and motivated to know itself. Knowing, for Faggin, is not merely describing, it is living. That is why he places consciousness and free will at the fundamental level, not as late byproducts of chemistry. He also speaks from personal experience. He spent years trying to design a conscious robot, and that effort forced a distinction he now considers decisive. Processing information is not the same as having experience. Computation manipulates symbols. Experience brings meaning. And meaning is not something you can squeeze out of mechanics alone. On that basis, he argues that matter described only as machinery has no resources by itself to generate consciousness and freedom. He then turns to origins. He speaks of potentiality and links it to the quantum vacuum, not as empty nothing, but as an active background with immense internal energy. Fluctuations appear and vanish, a foam of possibilities that precedes any stable form. At that level, there is openness for novelty, but no settled point of view. To explain how potential becomes lived reality, he introduces the idea of a first time. In that first act of knowing, the one brings into existence what it knows. Knowing and being are joined in a single event. That event creates a direction, a vantage point, and direction becomes identity. With identity comes what he calls Seity, his term for a whole part, a local expression of the one that seeks to know itself from its own perspective. He uses the image of a cell dividing. Each division preserves the full informational content, yet produces a new center of experience. The one can remain whole while generating many viewpoints within itself. Through this lens, he reframes the Big Bang. It is not life emerging from nothing. It is the transition from the quantum vacuum as pure potential to the one actively knowing itself. And he ends with a blunt thought. The truly strange claim is not that consciousness is fundamental, but that life could arise from nothing at all. Faggin frames the issue through the contrast between the classical world, often pictured as deterministic, and the quantum world, which describes possibilities with probabilities. When he mentions Einstein, Faggin points to a powerful intuition. If you know the complete state of a system, you can know how it will evolve. Quantum theory breaks it. Instead of a single trajectory, it offers a spread of possible outcomes, each with weight. For Faggin, the real difficulty is the step from many possible realities to one definite fact. We use that step constantly in practice. It supports statistical predictions. It matches experiments. And yet, the standard account still leaves an awkward gap. How does an open set of possibilities become a single shared event? He treats the wave function as a language of potential, a structured description of what could happen. Physics calculates those probabilities with accuracy, but the last move, when one possibility becomes the one that actually occurs, feels like a missing chapter. Faggin describes collapse as the moment a superposition stops being open and a concrete result appears. The usual story treats it as random. He adds a second property. It is not algorithmic. In his formulation, collapse is random and non-algorithmic. An algorithm is a rule-bound procedure that, given the same inputs, produces the same outputs. Collapse does not behave like that. It looks like a selection that cannot be reduced to step-by-step computation. In his framing, collapse converts quantum information into a single classical answer, something that can be shared, recorded, and agreed upon. From there, he proposes an interpretation. If several outcomes are genuinely real as potential, then selecting one has the character of a decision. That is why he links collapse to free will, not as a mood inside the brain, but as the capacity to select between alternatives that exist as options. He also pushes back on a simplification. Collapse, for him, does not depend on a human being looking at an experiment. What matters is interaction. In his language, fields interact with fields, and that relationship is sufficient to produce a definite result. Measurement stops being an external act performed by a person and becomes an internal process of the quantum fabric itself. In that interaction, he makes an even stronger claim. Each field can occupy roles we normally separate. It can be observer, observed, and agent at once. If everything is described as relationships between fields, the boundary between subject and object starts to lose its force. The key question is not who is watching, but how the system relates, exchanges information, and stabilizes into one outcome. From there, Faggin connects the physics back to his cosmology through a thread. Knowing implies relationship, and a stable relationship requires communication. Communication requires symbols. For meaning to be shared, there must be agreement, repetition, memory, and common reference. Symbols let meanings be expressed and stabilized inside a shared frame, consistent enough for continuity. In his view, reality in space and time rests on rules of correspondence that keep experience ordered rather than chaotic. To make it intuitive, he reaches for a technological metaphor, a device operating inside an environment, like a drone inside a scenario, until there is a way to inhabit that perspective. The image carries the point. A consciousness that knows itself needs a viewpoint, an interface, and stable references. With references, you get sequences, distances, change, and history. Decisions leave traces. What was potential becomes record. At the end, Faggin returns to a parallel he cares about, explaining consciousness as a byproduct of something with no consciousness leaves a gap. Explaining life as pure chance leaves a similar gap. When he criticizes randomness as an explanation, he is not denying probability. He is saying that chance is not a sufficient cause. The word can describe a distribution or our ignorance, but it does not explain the emergence of organization, direction, and novelty with meaning. So his conclusion keeps the thread tight. Between possibilities and facts, there is selection. And in his framework, that selection touches free will at the deepest level, not as an illusion inside the brain, but as a fundamental feature of how reality becomes real. Federico Faggin offers an idea that reorganizes how we look at the physical world. Space-time is best understood as memory and as communication. He sums it up in a line that holds the whole thread. Space-time is the memory of a universe that knows itself. From that starting point, shared reality appears when a whole expresses itself through perspectives, and those perspectives become coordinated. Faggin describes that coordination as communication. The claim is simple. Where there is relationship, there is exchange, and exchange needs a stable structure, so that what happens here can be meaningful there. In his framework, space and time do not merely sit in the background. They organize relationship until it becomes orderable, describable, repeatable. Space-time has a job. It makes communication between perspectives visible and trackable, so that it can be shared. To clarify, he reaches for biological analogies. He talks about cells and the genome. A cell lives as a unit. It has boundaries, functions, a local point of view. Yet the genome contains the broader plan, and each cell participates in an organism that exceeds it. With that image, Faggin stresses a central feature. The part remains linked to the whole, and the whole expresses itself through the part. In his words, the whole is present in each part, in some way, even when the part cannot see the whole directly. That is his doorway into the whole part idea, a local perspective that stays connected to a wider totality. The individual view is real, but it is not isolated. It is a perspective within a larger knowing. He then turns to time with a blunt statement. The past does not exist. What exists is experience in the present, and what we call the past is memory. The lived event happens now, feeling, perceiving, deciding, and then it is recorded. That record is what gives continuity. In his way of putting it, the present contains effective experience, the past is a stored trace, and the future appears as prediction, a spread of possibilities inferred from what is already known. So time becomes organized memory, experience now, record that remains, projection of what might come next. Continuity does not depend on a living past. It depends on memory shaping the present. This leads into another image he uses to explain shared reality. He says shared reality is like a screen, and he sharpens the metaphor, like the classical output of a quantum computer. A screen gives stable results, objects, positions, sequences, measurements. Beneath that output is a quantum level that does not present itself as solid things, but as relations and possibilities. The point of the metaphor is practical. The screen allows agreement between perspectives. Two people can point to the same location, repeat an experiment, recognize a pattern, because the output is consistent enough to coordinate on. Here, Faggin introduces a distinction that runs through his whole framework. The screen shows organized information, but the meaning of that information appears in consciousness. Meaning is not in the output. It arises in the one who lives it. Shared reality delivers data, forms, regularities. Interpretation, value, intimate understanding belong to experience. That is why he treats the classical world as an interface. It stabilizes outcomes, preserves records, and makes coordination possible, even though it cannot contain meaning by itself. Put the three pieces together: communication, memory, screen, and the loop closes. Space-time organizes communication between perspectives and makes it orderable. It preserves memory as trace and record. It offers a shareable output where facts become visible and repeatable. And beneath it all sits the same direction Faggin keeps returning to: a universe that knows itself leaves traces, and those traces are what we call space and time. When you look at it that way, reality is not just what happens, it is what can be remembered, shared, and recognized across viewpoints. Space-time is the structure that makes that possible, and the evidence, in Faggin's view, that knowing is not an afterthought of the cosmos, but part of its foundation. Notice what this implies for everyday life. When you agree on a place, a name, or a measurement, you are synchronizing memories, not accessing a raw object. The thing is the stable pattern that survives comparison. Space-time is the shared ledger that keeps the pattern legible together, always. Federico Faggin introduces a hypothesis about dark matter that grows directly out of his idea that space-time functions as memory. For him, every experience leaves a record, and that record does not vanish. It remains as permanent memory. Within that frame, the practical question is, where does that storage live? What kind of substrate could hold it steady whilst the visible universe keeps changing? Faggin turns to dark matter. He notes that it entered mainstream discussion only in recent decades, and he highlights what he sees as decisive. In the cosmic balance, there appears to be far more dark matter than ordinary matter. That imbalance opens a conceptual possibility. Perhaps what we cannot see or touch is precisely what supports what we can. His proposal is direct, and he does not present it as a close conclusion. He suggests that dark matter could be the support of the permanent memory of experience. The reason is its elusiveness. Dark matter, as described in cosmology, does not take part in the everyday exchanges that make up ordinary objects: light, chemistry, heat, friction. That separation makes it a candidate for stability, something that is not constantly reshaped by the visible churn. Faggin links this idea to the expansion of the universe. In his view, the one continues to know itself. That knowing grows, and therefore requires increasing capacity to be retained. So he connects the growth of space-time with the growth of storage. As he puts it, more space-time is needed to store that knowledge, like adding capacity to a hard drive. The metaphor is functional. More room to keep what has happened, so that history does not dissolve back into flux. In this way of thinking, dark matter becomes a natural candidate for permanent structures. It would act less like familiar objects and more like repositories, deposits of memory for the perspectives that exist in the universe. Faggin notes that dark matter is inferred through gravitational effects rather than through light. That fits his image of an invisible archive. It is there, it has weight, it shapes structure, but it does not show up as a lit object. In his framework, permanent memory would contain the experience of individual Seities and also the cumulative learning of the One. That is why he imagines dark matter structures as a kind of cosmic library. Expansion in that picture is the library growing, more capacity to store new experience without erasing what came before. Time becomes tied to an archive. The past, as lived experience, is gone, but its trace remains. At the same time, Faggin is careful about what he is claiming. He flags it openly. This is highly speculative. His aim is not to declare a discovery, but to show how a framework generates hypotheses. If the universe learns cumulatively, and if that learning is preserved, then something has to carry it. Dark matter, in his view, is at least a plausible place to look. In other words, dark matter would not just be extra mass. It would be the universe's long-term storage layer, holding memory steady whilst visible matter keeps changing. Federico Faggin presents knowing as a creative act, tied to experience and to meaning. For him, when consciousness knows something for the first time, that knowing enters existence as lived experience. He puts it bluntly. All new knowledge is creation. That line only makes sense if we're clear on what he means by knowing. For Faggin, knowing is not primarily about symbols. Knowing is about meaning, not symbols. Symbols come later. They are useful tools, but they are not the core. So why do symbols matter at all? Because they make communication possible between different perspectives. An inner experience does not travel intact from one person to another. What travels is a sign, a word, a gesture, a shared form. Symbols point towards meaning. They help coordinate, they help remember. They let two minds align on the same reference, even when the experience itself remains private. Here, Faggin adds a piece of physics that supports his larger point. A quantum state, he argues, cannot be reproduced identically. Exact copying is not what the quantum level is built for. And that matters because it reinforces a key difference. Experience does not duplicate in the way a digital file duplicates. A computer can copy information cleanly, but that copy is still not a lived state. It is a pattern without interior. He uses a personal example to make the gap undeniable. The love he feels for his child is not something he knows by reading a definition. He knows it by being in it. Another person can understand the word love, recognize it in stories, and use it correctly. But the lived state belongs to his own interiority. It is first person, not transferable. That is where he brings in a crucial term, qualia. Qualia are how experience shows up from the inside. Lived color, lived pain, lived joy, lived significance. In his short phrasing, qualia bring meaning. And with that, he links the discussion to what he calls spirit, understood not as superstition, but as the domain of meaning, the essence that accompanies quantum information when it becomes experience. At this point, Faggin proposes a simple triad to keep the ideas organized. The body is classical information. The mind is quantum information. Spirit is the meaning of quantum information. The triad is a guide, not a set of clean cuts. He warns that reality does not divide into neat, separate boxes. So he suggests a better picture: overlaps. He uses a color wheel as the analogy. There is no rigid border between red and orange. There are blended regions. In the same way, body, mind, and spirit have zones where they interpenetrate. In the overlap between body and mind, Faggin places life, information that blends the classical with the quantum, living information that cannot be reduced to pure mechanism. In the overlap between mind and spirit, he places qualia. This is where consciousness, free will, and identity appear as lived experience. And in the overlap between spirit and body, he places permanent memory, the record of self-knowledge held in a stable way. As he puts it, memory has to be permanent. That brings him back to symbols, but now with a sharper purpose. Quantum states shift. Experience happens in the present and passes quickly as present. If anything is to endure, it must be recorded. For remembering, he argues, experience has to be translated into symbols, into a form that can persist, be retrieved, and be shared. Meaning becomes communicable, and memory becomes sustained as a trace that remains. The thread is consistent. Knowing is creation. Creation is lived meaning. And symbols are the bridge that lets meaning leave a lasting footprint without pretending it can be copied like a file. Federico Faggin starts from a point he repeats calmly, because for him, it organizes everything else. We are not the body. The body is there. It moves, perceives, ages, and responds to the environment. And yet, in Faggin's framework, our deeper identity is something else. He argues that we can control the body, and that the body functions as an instrument that makes experience possible in this reality. Sensory input arrives as signals, the organism processes them as information, and that information becomes a lived world in the one who perceives it. He adds an important nuance. What we call reality is, to a large extent, the result of sensory information organized by the body and interpreted by consciousness. The world does not arrive as a finished object. It arrives as streams of signals that become experience. That is why he describes what we are as a conscious field, and he's precise about the word field. A field is not a sealed object with hard edges. It is something with presence, interiority, and the capacity to choose. At this point, he names what he calls the real clash of beliefs. One starting point reduces reality to space-time and matter-energy. Another treats consciousness and free will as fundamental. Faggin notes that many debates get stuck here because the starting assumption quietly decides what counts as possible before the conversation even begins. Then he turns to a familiar human feeling: separation. Many people feel isolated, even when they speak about unity. Faggin links that feeling to a purpose. He suggests we are here to have experience in order to know ourselves, and he is careful about what that means. It is not knowing ourselves as bodies. In his view, there is a wider self that wants to experience aspects of itself directly. In that logic, the body is organized and conditioned to express certain aspects as a concrete way of living them in space and time. He even says that we act as representatives of that wider self within this reality. With that base, he defines the ego without turning it into a villain. Believing we are the body is the first illusion. It is also, he says, how we start on the wrong foot, because that narrow identification forces a series of conclusions. Consciousness becomes an accident, freedom becomes a convenient story, meaning becomes a byproduct. He then gives a functional definition. The part of us that believes it is the body is the ego. And he adds a practical observation. When the ego believes it is the body, it behaves like the body. It seeks safety. It reacts to threat. It clings to control. It builds a personal narrative and treats that narrative as the whole of identity. To name the conscious field without leaning on worn-out language, Faggin proposes a specific term: Seity. In his explanation, Seity refers to a quantum field with consciousness and free will, and he clarifies a point that often gets missed. The ego is not outside Seity. It is a part of Seity, a part of that wider consciousness operating from identification with the body. He also explains why he changes the name. In mainstream language, people speak of the quantum field as if By definition, it cannot have consciousness or free will. Faggin calls that prior ban scientism. He is not rejecting the scientific method. He is challenging the move where a metaphysical prohibition is treated as a final scientific rule. With that, his map becomes clear. The body is an instrument. The ego is partial identification. Seity is the conscious identity that lives, knows, and decides. Separation is an effect of perspective and habit, not the deepest truth. And the human task becomes practical, to recognize in real time when the ego is speaking and when a wider space opens, the space of Seity, which is the one actually having the experience. This matters because identification changes what you notice. When the ego drives, attention narrows, and the world looks like risk, scarcity, and comparison. When Seity leads, attention widens, and the same moment carries more options: patience, curiosity, compassion, and genuine choice, not reflex. Federico Faggin returns to the idea of a participatory universe associated with John Wheeler, and he presses one point. The sharp separation between observer and world is held in place by a prior choice. In quantum physics, he says, the same issue keeps resurfacing. Where do you place the cut between subject and object? Wherever you draw it, the story changes. So sooner or later, you have to choose your starting wager. Do you begin with a supposedly objective world and then try to explain the subject as a late byproduct? Or do you begin with conscious experience and let cosmology organize itself from there? In his critique of strong materialism, Faggin frames it as a question that keeps its edge. If you define matter as not conscious, how do you then get consciousness out of it without smuggling in a miracle? He applies the same pressure to free will. A universe described as strictly deterministic does not, by itself, yield genuine freedom. It yields behavior, plus a story we tell about choice. For him, that gap is central. He then draws a practical distinction between what quantum theory describes and what we live as shared reality. Quantum theory gives possibilities with probabilities, but that is not yet the shareable world. The shareable world is what several people can confirm consistently, the outcome we can all point to, the result that holds still. That is why he returns to his metaphor. The universe behaves like a quantum computer that calculates possibilities, and the concrete event depends on selections he links to free will at the level of interacting fields. Then he shifts from theory to experience. Faggin says plainly that without a transcendent experience of being a whole part, unity within unity, his framework would never have formed. That experience, he claims, gave him the key to take a whole part seriously, not as poetry, but as recognition. From there, he looks at biology, cell and organism. The cell has its own boundary and function, yet it exists inside a larger whole that it both serves and expresses. For him, that is a living hint of how the one can remain whole, whilst generating many local centers of experience. From the same thread, he questions the idea of pure objectivity that depends on a separate subject. He proposes direct verification, personal, repeatable, available to anyone willing to do the work. He adds an explicit warning. This does not require drugs, and he urges people to avoid that route. The aim is not to distort the mind, but to clarify it. He describes his own sequence in simple terms. He recognized his unhappiness. He accepted responsibility rather than blaming circumstances. He wanted to know. He trusted that the universe could answer. And then, he says, the experience arrived. He insists he had never read anything like it and did not imagine such a shift was possible. He contrasts this with our dependence on giant instruments. This kind of checking, he argues, does not require a collider or expensive equipment. It requires honesty, patience, and perseverance. Out of that effort comes his hypothesis. Consciousness and free will are fundamental. Behind them sits an impulse. The one wants to know itself, and that same intention appears in us as the desire to know who we are. At the end, he pushes back against a familiar dismissal. The mystics already knew this. The yogis, the Buddha, the gurus. Faggin calls that the same posture as Scientism in a different costume, shutting down the question so you don't have to do the work of knowing. There is a spiritual version of arrogance too, because in a participatory universe, the observer is not a spectator. The observer is part of what becomes real, and the deepest shift for Faggin is choosing your starting point, matter first or experience first, and then following that choice all the way down. And that concludes our video. If you enjoyed the content as much as we did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our updates. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next video.